Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to resilience, leadership, crisis management, business continuity, COVID, anything that helps you, your organization, or your community prepare for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free. You can find me on LinkedIn. I am the only Alex Fullick there, so I am really easy to find, and I do respond to everything I get. Just a quick announcement. I will be speaking at the Continuity and Resilience Today conference, they've just gone 3 days, November 30th to December 2nd. It is now virtual. Unfortunately, it was only an hour away. I was hoping to get there and be in person, but so be it. Everything's virtual. So hopefully I'll see you online and you attend my presentation there. Many of you know that I am an avid reader. I love to read for entertainment purposes, knowledge, reading different perspectives on things. I just love to read and read. And recently I came across a book that melds my appreciation for leadership and management and those kind of topics with some Buddhist topics like mindfulness. And the book is The Mindful Leader: 7 Practices for Transforming Your Leadership, Your Organization, and Your Life. And my guest today is the author of this book, Michael Bunting. Michael, welcome to the show.
Alex, great to be with you.
How are you today?
Really good. As I say, it's this nice sunny day. We're in late spring, early summer in Australia, so it's lovely outside.
And we're getting the opposite. Where I am, we're getting into the fall. The leaves are falling. It looks nice, but temperatures are going down. And anytime now that stuff is going to start falling from the sky, Yes. Not looking forward to that. Yes. Michael, I know I've read the book and your biography and all. Can you take a moment or two and tell us a little about yourself, what you do, and how you got into it?
The biggest, I suppose, sometimes it's a hard question to answer, but simply speaking, my biggest role nowadays is clients will ask us, mostly big corporations, will ask us to help them change their culture. So they will have identified either they're not getting the right people, or there's too much staff turnover, or they're not innovating enough. And they've identified, and there's not many of them that do it, but they've identified that their culture and the behaviors of the organization are holding them back. And then we'll come in and we'll help them redefine the behaviors that they want. And then we'll do all the deep work, typically with the senior leadership, usually the top 10% of the company, because whether we like it or not, they shape the culture, the senior leadership.
Very true.
And then the work goes quite quickly deeper, because one of the tragedies of modern civilization, I think, is that we're not taught in our formal education how to manage our mind, how to manage our emotional world, and therefore how to manage our behavior. So when we are looking at behavior change, we all do behaviors that are not good for us. And when we look at behavior change, most people just don't know how to execute on that. And that's when things get a bit more interesting and deep, but still typically aligned to 2 or 3 key behavioral outcomes the organization wants to achieve.
And when they want to make that change, they call you, right?
They call us. Yeah, we're one of those kinds of organizations, and the programs typically go for 2 to 3 years. And that backstory is, for me, the deep fascination with the mind. I think I didn't realize it, but when I was younger, I didn't realize I didn't understand trauma, and I grew up in a traumatized, I grew up in a really good home with 2 parents that were still married until my dad died 4 years ago. So everything was pretty stable. There was money. But I grew up in a home that many of us are facing now, which is a home that suffers with proximate abandonment. So my parents weren't really emotionally available. They were busy and had their own shut down issues. And it resulted in what I came to later understand as a kind of cool trauma in myself, which then led to insecurity, which led to a kind of mild depression in my 20s, but a lot of angst and messiness inside that I didn't realize, because I was very driven, but came to understand later that, my whole journey into the deeper awareness work was really driven from my own pain. It was a little bit like, this life. I remember sitting at 22, I don't know if any of you or your listeners have experienced this, but you go into the workplace and there's a bit of a dream about what the workplace is. And then you get there and then you see, 40-year-olds And all they're doing is looking forward to their next holiday with their family, and they're going home and watching a bit of telly, and it's like the mundaneness of it all horrified me. And I asked the question, there must be more to this existence than just working, holidaying, and consuming. Hence, getting into the deeper side of things.
Well, congratulations on the book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I pulled out a bunch of things that we can touch on from here that we'll discuss here today. But I just wanted to touch on a couple of things. As you were talking, obviously I'm the business continuity, organizational resilience, operational resilience kind of world. But a lot of what you said, especially with regards to culture and leadership, sets that culture and it guides the way for other people. That's a big part of what's happening in the business continuity resiliency world right now. They're talking about it. So it's kind of even you were a little bit ahead of the curve, so to speak.
There's also fascinating research coming out now and a lot of evidence that the traditional idea of changing people or giving them the really old-fashioned, give them a laminated card with 10 tips at the end of a training program, and then it all will be well. It was now, we collectively call it horizontal development, which is the idea that if there's behavior or issues in the workplace, it's always a skills gap. So you give them new skills and all will be well. That just falls over. It's just not true. We're mostly driven by unconscious biases and unconscious trauma, unconscious ideas, unconscious pain avoidance. As it was beautifully put to me by one of the very senior leaders I work with, he said, before we started doing self-awareness work, I thought I was a very rational decision maker. I've now come to discover that most of my decisions were emotionally based. Just because I was denying that I had any emotions didn't mean that my emotions were driving my decision making. And so in the work, we're discovering, flexibility, change, open-mindedness, resilience, all of those things. You can't necessarily just give people skills. You actually have to do some mindset work. You have to do some emotional work.
Yeah, you can't buy software. You can't just read a book and then expect everything to change in a day or two, which is what a lot of managers think when someone's gone on a training or done something like that, come back and snap of a finger, everything's different.
And to be fair, it's a very appealing idea. I love it. But wouldn't it be true? It'd be like, wouldn't it be true? If my marriage is not going well, just take this pill and your marriage will be great. Wouldn't it be lovely if these quick fixes actually existed?
Yeah, it would be nice. Well, congratulations on the book. I know you touched on a few things that we're actually going to talk about now. So let's kind of jump into this. First of all, let's clarify, what is mindfulness? What does it actually mean?
Yeah. So it's very, very original meanings, given that its origins are in Buddhism. And again, for those listeners know that Buddhism is interesting because it has no belief systems. So even though it's classed as a religion, it's absolutely the opposite of a religion, in the sense that the idea in Buddhism is to challenge all the belief systems and really become more and more aware. So when we are believing, often we're losing awareness. That's the first interesting part of it. Historically, the word, which suits, by the way, a very cynical, scientific-minded audience. That's why it's a great set of practices in there. What's interesting is the word mindfulness comes from a Pali word called sati, which means to remember. And it's remembering a few things. Obviously, remembering to be here and now is the thing. It's remembering reality, not your perceptions of reality or your dream about the future or the past. So it's this invitation to presence is mindfulness. The second thing is that mindfulness, by definition, is extending your time in the present. So we now know from a whole bunch of research that when we are in the present, as in we're attentive, we're connected with the senses, we hear, we're our happiest, our most creative, our most resilient, and our most effective. So the range of good things happen when we're present. Mindfulness is about training ourselves to stay in the present for extended periods of time. In a nutshell. And then once you've got that extended ability to stay aware, it's being able to apply it outwardly and inwardly. Inwardly is by far the most challenging of the two aspects. But can I be mindful in this conversation? But can I also be mindful of my biases, mindful of my emotional content in my system, mindful of my speech, my thinking, mindful of my intention? Can I be awake to all of those things? So in a sense, mindfulness is also a very technically precise method of developing self-awareness. In fact, you can't develop self-awareness as a practice without mindfulness. It's like trying to swim without water. You can't do it. It's technically impossible.
What are some of the misconceptions of mindfulness? Because sometimes you can read articles or see a webinar or whatever online. Obviously, social media has all kinds of things. And mindfulness just gets touted as almost anything. So
Yes.
I know you just described what it is, but what isn't it? What
Yeah.
are the misconceptions for
Yeah. So it's definitely not candles and crystals. It's definitely not woo-woo with all the kind of like, it's definitely also not, it's a part truth that's been distorted, that a lot of people think of mindfulness as like a mental health. It's like a warm bath on a cold night. You can go into this, you can practice this mind, get all zen, and relax and chill out. It's true and untrue in a sense. Mindfulness is useful for calming ourselves down, but if you carry on practicing mindfulness, very soon, very quickly into it, you begin to meet your actual personal demons that you've been ignoring and running away from and burying in chocolate and alcohol and Netflix and all the other things we run away from in ourselves. So it's not a sort of warm, fuzzy, kind of fix-all lovely thing. Mindfulness it certainly supports a deeply well mind over time, but it's probably more accurate as exercise. It's probably better to be thought of as exercise. It's not necessarily pleasant and fun. It requires discipline, but gee, the benefits are amazing. That's probably the best way of thinking of it.
And it's not, what I'm getting is also, it's not a quick fix. You don't just practice it or, have that warm bath one night and then everything is rosy again. It's, as you say, exercise. So like going to the gym, you have to keep doing it, right?
Correct. And the other thing that we found is that 99% of mindfulness we see taught in corporations is what's called calming mindfulness. It's like the idea is to concentrate and balance the mind, which is a little bit like giving someone a Ferrari and giving them only first gear. It's kind of like, so it's very misunderstood. Mindfulness is, if you look at the latest work out of Harvard on adult development theory, it's this idea that what determines maturity in human beings. If we were both 40 and you were more mature than me, can you measure that? Turns out you can measure it now. Harvard have worked out how to measure it. And then what constitutes growth or what would make you more mature than me? And what makes you more mature is the ability to see patterns of mind and emotion and habits inside yourself, and then the ability to manage those constructively for better outcomes for you in the world, right? The more immature you are, your patterns just run you. So for example, you might have this need for people's approval, and you just can't help trying to impress people all the time. And sometimes you lie and you're not in integrity because you're trying to impress, and you're not even aware of it. And that's an immaturity. So the process
it kind of reminds me of kids in high school, or when we're in high school, we're trying to impress everybody so that we become the popular kid.
Yes, and we haven't thought it through of going, well, what will the popular kid thing give me? And then, we haven't deeply thought of it because we're too young at that stage. What I'm really looking for is a feeling of self-acceptance. That's what I'm really, deep acceptance. And I've noticed when my acceptance is dependent on those other people, no matter how much I get it, I'm still anxious and fearful I might lose it. Is that really wise? What if I had complete self-acceptance and then I no longer needed those people's acceptance to feel okay? Wouldn't that be preferable? Because that's independent well-being, not dependent well-being. So mindfulness takes you down through those deep questioning and understanding and seeing the patterns inside yourself. And ultimately, in terms of happiness, it's about being more independently happy, not constantly worried about the conditions around us to be okay, which is the holy grail in a world of COVID or a world of uncertainty. When the mind needs wellness based on stability and certainty, it's a recipe for a constant mess inside.
Well, I know it's not easy because years ago, about 15 or more years ago, I started mindfulness training, and let me tell you, it was not easy when I
Yeah.
started, because I did discover things that I didn't know was there, and we're going to get more to that because I've got a question about that later on. But that's all I'm going to say at this point, because I know you've got some other comments on that one. And believe it or not, we've already come to the end of our first segment. See, it doesn't take long to go off script, and we've only gone through one topic so far. We're talking today with Michael Bunting, the author of The Mindful Leader, and we'll be right back.
Thank you, Alex.
Welcome back. Today we are talking with Michael Bunting, the author of The Mindful Leader. Michael, great first segment. I want to start off right off the bat. There was a quote on page 1 of all places that captured my attention. I was wondering if you could kind of talk about it a little bit, and I'll read the full quote. The behavior of leaders has an enormous impact on those they lead, and the more senior they are, the greater the impact. Leadership is both a privilege and a burden. Can you explain what you meant by that?
So the privilege part, obviously, leadership comes with power. It comes with influence. It comes with often adoration, or people being nice to you when they wouldn't ordinarily be nice to you. So there's a lot of privilege that comes with leadership. The best leaders I've worked with also see leadership as a burden because they see it as a service, and they see it as a process of empowering and developing and looking after the people they lead. They don't think of it as, I'm here to be worshipped. They see it as, I'm here to serve others. Very much like a good parent would know. If anyone's listening to this and you've trying your best to be a good parent, you're not just parenting by accident. You're consciously trying to be a good parent. You will know that that's a burden. It's both a privilege and a burden. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that you talked about the impact of leaders. Obviously we know intuitively, we all know that your boss makes a huge impact. We know from all the research that the number one reason people leave their jobs is not the company, it's their boss.
Yeah.
And you can change the company culture, but if your boss is still not great, it's still going to have a huge negative impact. In fact, it's cruel. One of our clients went through this, where they did this beautiful culture change, but you'd meet people who still had these difficult bosses, and it was almost like they were left out of the party because they were still having daily suffering. So we researched this ourselves. Kouzes and Posner, who I wrote my first book with, are the world's most researched leadership authors. They've got 5 million people in their database and so on and so on. And their research showed that 37% of a person's engagement at work can be explained by their boss's behavior. Right. And of course, a lot of their engagement at work is determined by internal factors, whether they like the job. That's nothing to do with the company. So they found that the leader's behavior is exponentially higher than any other impact external to the person on their engagement at work. And we know engagement is broadly measured by say, stay, strive. They say positive things. They're intending to actually stay there, and they're willing to give extra because they love the organization. I sometimes jokingly say you could also say stay, strive is a good measurement of a great marriage. Are you intending to stay in the marriage? Do you say positive things about your husband or wife to other people when you're around? And are you willing to put extra effort in the relationship because you value it? That's a measurement of engagement. When we did our research on the mindful leader, because we added a few practices to Kouzes and Posner, our research showed it was 40%. So 40% of a person's engagement can be explained by their boss's behavior. Then we did this other small piece of research on mental health. We became curious about what's the impact of a boss's or a leader's behavior on the mental health of their direct reports. And our research showed a third. So 33% of a person's mental health can be explained by their boss's behavior. And often when we're presenting to leaders, we present the engagement stats. That's a bit sobering for leaders. It's like, so the way I behave each day is having a significant impact on the productivity, the ability to innovate, the ability to collaborate, et cetera, of my direct reports. And as I said to you before we came online, most people have no idea how to change behavior or work with their behavior. No fault of their own. They just weren't educated on it. So now you've got this horrible, but then additionally, oh my goodness, the mental health of my direct reports, the way I behave is having a third of their mental health can be explained by behavior. You add to that the difficulty of leadership, because leadership, in summary, we've all got our brief summary, and it's a complex subject, but I think leadership is primarily about love and honesty. And the honesty part is where we do the accountability, the clear standards, there's boundaries in the honesty, the honest feedback, the receiving of honest feedback. And then there's the love part, right? The I care, you matter, etc. about that. And leadership's hard because you're holding the interests of the organization, and you've got to do tough conversations, etc. And you've got to sometimes, hold people accountable. And yet you're still looking at their mental health.
Isn't that love part the kind of the aspect that people try to stay away from? Because even though if you're talking about your partner, yes, it's easy to talk about love, but when you talk about your boss, or your boss is talking about their employers,
yeah,
it's almost frowned upon. Like, no, you can't talk like that.
Yes. So, and we don't normally, but to be fair, there's these underlying, if I'm empowering a person, if I'm interested in their growth, if I'm a boss and I'm helping a person grow, what is that other than an act of love? It's an act of care for that human being, saying you matter, and I want you to flourish. I don't want to micromanage you. I want to help you grow and learn because your life matters. That is an act of care, if you will, if that's more palatable to people to hear. But it's definitely an aspect of leadership, and it's a tricky part because leadership has a huge impact. But what we know is that you have to get both right, and that's the hard part. We found in all of our anecdotal experience and all the research tells us that extremely few leaders have the balance right, where they've got the caring, the genuine caring part of leadership right, and the tough, honest, accountable part of leadership. But we find most leaders will default too much towards one or the other. They'll be too nice and too rational, conflict avoidant. They won't do accountability. That creates harm. Or the leaders that are just tough, drive, and they disconnect with the human beings around them, and there's no care. To get both right requires amazing maturity. But the context of that is that obviously the more senior you get, the more important that becomes, because the impact's greater. But even if you're listening to this and you lead one person, your behavior still has significant impact on those people or that person.
I know I've worked with a lot of leaders who do that. They're not very good at all on the love side of things. It's always push, results oriented. We need deliverables. Oh, you delivered that 2 days early. Great. Now you've got 2 days to do this. Like push more and more on people, and it creates resentment. And one of the examples I always think of is a leader who tries to come across as loving and caring, and has 2 ears and listens, and says they have an open door policy, but you can never talk to them. They're never there, and you always have to book an appointment with their administrative assistant or somebody else, and that gets rescheduled 3 or 4 times as a way of pushing you off, but still walk around, I have an open door policy. And all it does is make people kind of start resenting you. Like, you call yourself a leader, I don't want to follow.
Exactly. The challenging part we're discovering in our work, and this is really the last 5 years of work's become very intense, is that how do you help a leader like that improve? And what we've discovered is we can give them techniques, like we can give them practices, like, well, you've got to thank people more often. You've got to, when people are doing something right and well, give them the specific details, show them you've noticed, tell them, I noticed you did X, Y, Z, and Z, tell them. What we've discovered, though, is that those practices still fall flat if the leader's actually not genuinely in it. Then the question is, well, how do you help them get genuinely appreciative of people? Well, it turns out that if you're not genuinely appreciative of people, some part of your emotional conditioning is shut down. Your heart is basically closed and shut down. We also know that having a shut down, closed heart is a place of misery. So we also know from trauma theory that many of us have our hearts shut down in our childhoods. So now, often when we're delving into that, we just thank people more often, be more appreciative. We're now starting to understand it's not as easy as that. And that sometimes you have to do a little bit deeper work for the person to help them understand, my heart is shut down, and that's not a good thing. Because often they think that's a good thing because you could just get results. No, it's not a good thing. It's not good for you, and it's not good for people around you. So how do we get you to open that heart a bit. And that's where the mindfulness work, particularly the developmental mindfulness work, becomes absolutely essential.
Well, based on that, I'm going to jump ahead on our agenda because that leads me to the expression you have, discomfort equals progress.
Yes, exactly. So it's difficult to explain that quickly. So let me try my best in 2
Well,
minutes.
you don't have, take your time. No rush.
So what happens for us is when we're growing up, we face various moments in our lives that are difficult or painful, and then we try and find ways to cope. Maybe it's the first time there was a soccer team picked, your football team being picked, and you were the last one to be picked. And we all have that memory where the pain of being excluded. And then what happens? Some part of us goes, you know what? I'm gonna be nice to people all the time, so I'm never excluded. We develop these strategies, these behavior sets in ourselves to avoid pain. And these then become very structured in ourselves and very what's called rigid. If you look at cognitive behavioral therapy or ACT, we have like a collection of rigid behaviors. And we use the example of leadership that, so I might be really nice, but I can't flex into the tough because I'm just sort of stuck in the rut of nice all the time, or I'm stuck in the rut of tough. So the holy grail of leadership maturity is psychological flexibility, the ability to be loving and tough, short-term, long-term, collaborative, decisive, this ability to be flexible. That requires us not to be stuck in rigid patterns. So when we're doing developmental work, we're invariably having to challenge some of our rigid patterns. So if it's a leader, for example, we used earlier, that needs to thank people more often or be more appreciative, they're having to challenge a rigid pattern inside themselves of just focusing on work, results. So they're having to challenge that behavior set move. Now that challenging process is extremely uncomfortable because they're very competent in driving tasks and probably very incompetent at the relationship stuff. So they have to move themselves into an area of incompetence and discomfort. Now, it's a sign if you're in the discomfort, you're in the new. The challenge is that if you can't and you don't know how to manage the discomfort, what do we do when we're uncomfortable? If our only tool set is to go back to the familiar or go back to that feeling of, I feel good in this and not good in that. Invariably, if you don't know how to stay in the discomfort and still do what feels odd and weird, you will always default back to the rigid pattern because the rigid pattern is where you find your emotional comfort. This is what I meant earlier when we had a leader saying, I prided myself on not being driven by my emotions. Pre-self-awareness work, post-self-awareness work with you, I now understand my life was completely driven by emotions because when I'm going into that rigid behavior, that's my version of emotional medication. I'm like, I'm medicating myself to feel comfortable in that familiar, and I'm not doing what's actually right and needed and more constructive as a leader. So that's what we mean when we say discomfort is a marker of growth. If you're not feeling uncomfortable, you're not growing, typically. But it also has its added, typically the holy grail of development in our work is I'm values-based. So I deeply understand what I stand for in this world. I have actions and behaviors that are deliberately aligning me to what I stand for, whether that be compassion or honesty, etc. And I'm acutely aware that I fail at it daily because I get caught in comforting behaviors and so forth. There's this conscious, deliberate, and I'm also aware that the journey into being really, really mastering being values-based is a very, very challenging, uncomfortable journey, but it's also what I call the journey home. Because when I'm deeply in line in the values, the mind, and we know from mindfulness practice, the mind and the body become congruent. The system settles down, vitality grows, credibility increases as a leader. All these good things happen.
It reminds me of an alcoholic or an addict, when they first, hopefully, are trying to clean themselves up, they get to a point where they are challenged. They are now facing some of those, and I'm by no means any kind of psychologist or anything like that, but they now are facing those demons. And unfortunately, some people can't handle that, and they do, as you say, fall back into previous patterns.
Yes.
Right.
And in fact, I sometimes I see rigidity as addiction. If my only way of dealing with an argument is trying to win it, then I would say you're addicted to winning. You're addicted to being right. And unfortunately, that rigidity in addiction is going to be very limited in its going to work for you sometimes, and a whole lot of other times it's not going to work for you. But because you're so stuck in the addiction of that rigidity, you become, your whole world becomes limited. Your relationships become limited. Your growth becomes limited. But it is an addiction. It's a form of comforting ourselves.
And as a leader, that's when you start seeing maybe your direct reports or other employees, your talent leaving, right?
And then the next addiction that comes usually for people at that point is rationalization. So what we do then is, oh, this is uncomfortable. People are leaving. We then tell ourselves a story. That's because they were idiots anyway. Or we have a range of storytellings in the mind. When life.
So we're justifying. We're trying to justify ourselves.
Yeah, so we have this thing in my new book. We talk about the first and second line of defense against growth, and the ways to comfort ourselves, which is anti-growth behavior. The first is denial and numbness. So we just deny flat out. I'm not a micromanager. I don't know what you're talking about. Or I'm not angry. I'm not critical. You're just an idiot. Kind of that silliness. We just deny and numb what, I don't feel any loneliness. I just happen to, be eating all the time. And it's not because I'm lonely. We just deny it, right? And how we deny is numbness. We shut ourselves down from feeling. And we have a myriad ways to do that. If there's a brief flicker of something getting through the numbness, it's like, oh my God, people are leaving. And there's this moment of time, it's like, oh, it might be about me. It might be my leadership. Now there's amazing pain. Now, remember, we've asked people over and over, they don't know how to deal with that pain. It's not their fault. They can be extremely smart. And we've had the privilege of working with Nobel Prize winning scientists who don't know how to do this stuff. It's not a question of intelligence. It's just a question of training. And so now I don't know how to deal with this feeling. So how do I deal with this feeling? I say to myself, this painful feeling, they were idiots anyway. They didn't really have a future in the business. It's good riddance. Whew, now I feel better. So the blaming mechanism, justifying mechanism is just another way. It's another addiction. It's another way of unhealthily trying to deal with feelings. And it's devoid of curiosity. It's devoid of openness. And therefore it's devoid of all possibility of growth and learning. All of it's gone. Wherever there's justification, rationalization, or denial or numbness, there's zero growth. And then there's always the repetition of rigid patterns.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our second segment. We're talking with the author of The Mindful Leader, Michael Bunting, and we will be right back. Welcome back. Today we are talking with Michael Bunting, the author of The Mindful Leader. Michael, great first and second segments. There are lots of good information. I guess one of the biggest things that I want to ask you, because I know we've got leaders of all persuasions listening, CEOs and data analysts that listen to this show. And so my question for you is, what are some of the things that a leader could start doing, or a person in general could start doing right now to set themselves on a mindful leadership path?
Great, thanks, Alex. This is a passionate area of our work. So the first thing to know, there's some basic theoretical foundations. First thing we know is that the latest research out of adult development tells us that you really can only change one behavior or work on one behavior over a 12 to 18 month period. So if you're thinking, even in this little podcast series, like, oh, I need 3 tips, or what's the 2 techniques, you're already on the wrong thinking path. The idea is what's one thing I can focus on and master over the next 18 months. I wanted to turn professional at golf once upon a time, and it's hard to work on your grip and your backswing and your forward. You can't do it. You've got to focus on, I'll just get this until this feels relatively comfortable, and I'll just focus on that one thing, even though there's another 20 things. So the first thing to do is know that conscious, mindful leadership is most of all about being deliberate about the aspiration of the human being you want to be as a leader. And let me explain that. When we start our work with leaders, we often start with a very first practice, which is walking the talk, we call model the way, or lead from mindful values. So we'll ask leaders, do you need to walk the talk? They all say yes. And then we go, great. So what's the talk you're trying to walk each day? At that point, everybody goes blank. What do you mean?
Yeah.
What's the talk I'm trying to walk? Well, surely if you're a leader who has to walk the talk, there would be a consciousness, a deliberateness about that talk. And again, it's shocking to me still that I would say realistically 99% of people fall down at this point. So we'd say, well, step one in becoming a more conscious, deliberate leader and human being is define for yourself the very talk that you're trying to walk. Now, don't make it too complex. And here's a couple of guidelines on doing that. We know from the research and leadership, the two most revered, precious qualities in leaders are honesty and respectfulness, or honesty and care, if you will. So we know honesty is the number one. It's heavily researched. We also know that 50% of us don't believe our bosses are honest.
Yeah.
So mastering honesty is one. The other is being respectful or caring. We also know that most people will struggle with one of those two more. So I know for me personally, as an example, is that I'm pretty good with honesty. Although I spent 8 years deliberately cultivating it, 8 terrifying years, I should say. But as a leader, the thing I struggle with is showing care. And I used to have simple disciplines. Like on a Monday morning, if I spoke to one of my direct reports, I would have to force myself to say, how was your weekend? Because there was a part of me that didn't give a damn. I just wanted to get onto the task and get on with it. But it was like, no, Michael, you're trying to cultivate who you want to be in this world. You're trying to be a caring and honest human being. And there's a few gaps there on the caring. And how can I begin to practice more? What does caring look? I then obviously discovered over time, why is caring unnatural? Because my heart is closed. How on earth did my heart get closed? Thanks, mom and dad. Thanks for my conditioning. Oh, okay. Do I want a closed heart? Am I happiest when my heart's feeling open or closed? Oh, turns out open. So there's a lot, it's a bit of depth underneath there. But step one is, what are the values that I really want to live by, lead by, and hold precious? No more than 2. The second question is, what's one behavior that would really challenge me? It would challenge my growth. One behavior that deeply aligns with my values, and that I can then invite my direct reports. I can go back to my direct reports and saying, you know what? Here's the talk I'm trying to walk. Secondly, here's one behavior that I think, I'm using very casual Aussie language now. Here's one behavior I think I suck at, and I think it has a negative impact on everybody. Right now, you're demonstrating accountability and humility. People love it. And then you say, here's something I need to work on. And I know when I work on this behavior, it makes me a better leader, makes your experience of working with me better. But because I suck at it, I'm going to fail at it sometimes. And I deeply appreciate if you can let me know when I'm failing. And I promise I will not attack you and blame you or defend. I might even have a little mantra. Thank you very much for the feedback. I'll keep doing better. And it's a long journey, but one behavior change, if done well, that's aligned with your values, is literally life-changing. And we've had the privilege, I've had the privilege of working with global CEOs of very large organizations. And this is what it boils down to, even for them. I remember one CEO I was working with said, what do you want to, one of my values is integrity. Okay, great. Turns out he's conflict avoidant. So some of his direct reports, he doesn't tell them the truth of what their performance and behavior is really like. And then they left just wondering. And he's like, he didn't realize, I'm out of integrity. Integrity is a value, but I'm not actually speaking truth. What's your deliberate practice? Give people on time, real time, honest feedback all the time. Okay. He then announced that to his team and apologized. I'm sorry, I have not been aligned with my values of integrity. It's in a subtle way. It's not like I'm breaking company rules or something, but in our relationship with you, my leadership with you, I'm not values aligned. If you can become values aligned and more deliberate in your behavior, you've already ticked most of the leadership boxes, because then people deeply trust you. They feel safe in your company. You are an accountable growth mindset leader by the very virtue of being like that. And if you don't have those fundamentals right as a leader, everything else is irrelevant. I don't care how good your vision is. I don't care how good you are at empowering people. If you're not fundamentally growth mindset oriented and values based, the deck of cards, and we'll all know this from our experience. Who wants to be led by someone they don't fundamentally trust? And who wants to be led by someone who's not humble enough to know that they're a work in progress and that they're constantly working on themselves? Nobody.
Yeah. I agree. A couple of things you said there. You talked about an open heart, asking people, how was your weekend or how was your evening or whatever. Years ago, that used to be me. I couldn't care less. I'm here to work. Stop talking. Just let's get this report done or whatever activity needs to get done. And that's it. I actually had to change that as well. Now, when we first got on this Zoom call, before we started recording, I was talking about, how are things down in Australia, and I was telling you about the festival that I saw in Sydney and things like that. Years ago, that would never have been me.
Yeah.
So as you were talking, I went, my God, that was me back then,
Exactly the same. And I want to iterate, because there might be some task-driven people listening to this going, yeah, next thing you chat all day and you'll never get tasks done. And I remember just reminding, it's about flexibility. It's not about rigidity. And there's a time and place for a chat, and there's a time and place for work. The problem is when it's all work and no chat, or it's all chat and no work, things fall apart. It won't work as well.
You have to find that balance.
Yeah.
And something else you kind of touched on too is when you kind of, for lack of a better way of saying it, fall off the path that you're choosing to walk. You're trying every day to make things better, using the example of integrity, that when you slip and stumble, don't hate yourself for it. Just pick yourself off, brush the dust off, and okay, I stumbled. Tomorrow is another day, and
yes,
again.
And this echoes important research that people who are compassionate with themselves grow faster and learn more than people who are highly critical of themselves. Because the cycle that happens is if I breach integrity, which we all do daily pretty much, I withhold a truth, I exaggerate something a bit, that's normal. But when I see it, if I can have a bit of compassion for myself and go, there you are, trying to win approval again by over-exaggerating something, it's okay. Come back to integrity. Like with kindness, then I can tolerate that truth. But if I tell myself, you're an idiot, you've broken, you're pathetic, look at you going for approval again, and you when are you going to get this right? What's wrong with you? And we criticize ourselves, we actually inject a tremendous amount of psychological distress and pain in our system. And then if you take about the approval, the need for approval, which was driving the values violation itself, well, when we're in a mess inside ourselves, we naturally want people's approval. We delegate our self-worth to others. And now we're setting ourselves on a guaranteed path to do more values violation. Then we go to denial. It's very self-judgment is a very crude and ineffective way to grow. There's a saying in honesty, truth and compassion, or in inner work, the truth and compassion are blood brothers. They come together.
Well, we only have about 5 minutes left. And there was so much more I know we could touch on. Do you want to take a few minutes and kind of give us some final thoughts on the mindful leader and some other aspects that you talk about in the book?
I think hard to answer now. Final thoughts, as we're progressing the mindful leader into, I'm busy writing my next book at the moment, and that's a deeper dive into some of the mindful leader practices. We're coming to discover that, as I've said already, that values are so significant. They're far more significant in adult development than we realized. So the question, values is and we also know from mindfulness theory, there's an expression in mindfulness theory that if you're not living by your values, mindfulness is a waste of time. It's like, well, what do you mean mindfulness is a waste of time? Because if you're not deeply aligned with basic core values like honesty, like care, like not stealing, basic values like that. If you're doing that in the workplace, let's just say you're not honest, what happens is the way the mind has to cope with that dishonesty, the dissonance, the saying one thing and doing another, the saying one thing and thinking another. The mind has to try and cope with that dissonance. The way it does it, it dulls us down. We go into numbness, we grab extra coffee, a donut, we distract ourselves in too much work. Because we're in some degree of psychological pain when we're not living our values. We now know from the ACT research, which is the gold standard in psychotherapy nowadays, or therapy, that when people are depressed or anxious, it's very likely, almost guaranteed, they've lost connection with their values. They've lost connection with what's important to them. And so we now also know that the living of values, the question is, why do we choose approval and being nice over being honest sometimes, or covering up our mistakes instead of being honest? Is that we're now starting to understand that that's because our value system is immature. And our value system is still externalized of ourselves. We don't value ourselves. We're trying to get others to value us. This is adult development. And what's so interesting about values work is that when you do cultivate values, if they're easy, you're doing it as a window dressing again. And we are to be excused that most of us think values, let's be fair, most people in organizations think the organization's values are BS. And anything talking about values is yawn and BS. But actually, that's because they dealt with it at such a superficial level. And that we all yearn to work with a values-based leader. We all yearn to be values-based. And crucially, we yearn for a deeply well mind and heart. And you cannot get that if you're not values aligned, because you're in this constant conflict. And it's not an accident. Gandhi said, happiness is in what you think and what you do and what you say are aligned. Integrity. And the word integrity means to be whole and complete without cracks and defects, to be whole. And so I think it's important to know that if you don't have a values practice, a deep values commitment in your life, mindfulness will be pretty much a disaster and a mess for you. Because every time you get still and clear enough, you're going to start encountering the dissonance in your system and the discomfort. And then you're going to, if you're meditating, it's like at the bell end, this mindfulness stuff sucks, it's not for me, because your systems are not in congruence. So values work and mindfulness work are blood brothers. And we talk about that quite extensively in The Mindful Leader, and in my next book, even more extensively. And again, it's not an accident that the primary, if I went to see a doctor in Australia and probably most countries, and I was anxious or depressed, and they recommended a therapist to me, psychological help, the most likely therapist I would visit is an ACT, acceptance commitment therapist. And that ACT therapist would help me understand my values. And they would help me understand the numbing habits I've got in my life that are actually taking me away from my values, but giving me short-term relief. So instead of talking to my wife, because I maybe value connection, I turn on Netflix and stare at the TV because I'm just too unwell to talk. Yes, I'm getting comforted, but I'm actually moving away from what's deeply important. And I'm in a fog in my life. Mm-hmm. And a bit of mindfulness is not really going to help that. You need the values work with it.
Yeah, I agree. Well, we've come to the end of the show. Michael, thank you so much. You've given a lot of great information, and congratulations on the book, The Mindful Leader. I know it's a couple of years old. I got to it late, but still, it's a great book. Lots of fantastic information in there, and you explained so many good things. I couldn't help it in your closing comments there, how you were talking about values and how many times we've worked to get back to the leadership part, works for managers or leaders or whoever the case may be, their organization, here's our values, and then you walk into the boardroom or a meeting room and it's the complete opposite. People are yelling at each other or whatever the case may be. Like, did everyone forget the values? Like, what's going on?
Yeah, it's just a tragedy. But there's a research that shows that if you're not going to follow your values, don't bother publishing them, because all you do is create more systems. And sadly, that is the vast majority of corporations around the world. There's a complete disconnect. And that's not because, I think just because people just don't understand the beauty and the personal inner wealth, the inner well-being that comes from that journey towards values. And I don't think those leaders are understanding the amazingly negative impact. They're creating economic prisoners in their business. People are not there because they're inspired or they trust. They're there because it's a job and it pays the bills. Everything's getting miserable underneath, which is, you look at the statistics, they back it up. I mean, I think it's only 9% of people are actively engaged at work nowadays.
Well, all these business schools and universities, they create leaders to make money. They don't create leaders to develop people.
Yes.
So there's the disconnect right from, before a leader even becomes a leader. That disconnect already exists.
Yeah.
But thank you so much, Michael. I really appreciate it. And Michael's book, again, I recommend it, The Mindful Leader. Grab a copy. Lots of great information. Michael, thank you for sharing your time and your expertise today. I really appreciate it.
Alex, thanks so much for having me on the show. I really enjoyed it.
Good. My pleasure. And to everyone watching, stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave a message and let me know what your thoughts are. If you'd like to be a guest on the show to talk about something related to business continuity, disaster management, COVID, personal well-being, anything that's relatable to those subjects, you can reach me through my LinkedIn profile, which is in the video description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. In the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.